I recently saw some discourse on Twitter that I feel pops up every few years. What is considered indie and what's an indie game? My name is Tess Fraser. I'm an indie game dev and content creator. If you're new here, do me a favor and like this video and subscribe to the channel. It helps me grow as a creator and lets me know that you're interested in this kind of content. If you're unaware, indie means independent, but I think over the years it's become harder to differentiate what actually designates a studio as independent. How much success can they have before they've stepped into the realm of AA or even AAA games? How many employees? How big of a budget? This is the tweet that inspired me to make this video. And I just want to reiterate that I don't want any hate towards the studio or the person that made the tweet. I just think it's worth discussing. So I am a one-man studio. I occasionally contract out a musician or an artist, but effectively my company is a single person. I've made a few $1,000s over the years, and pretty much all of my games have an effective budget of zero. I think we can safely say that I'm an indie dev and that my games are indie. Rockstar North produces GTA 5. More than 1,000 people worked on that game. It cost $265 million to produce. I think it's safe to say that GTA 5 was not an indie game. And actually, maybe even further than AAA. That game was so hard to produce and took so long, I'd almost argue that we need a destination beyond AAA. But I digress. So, for the sake of argument, I think it's actually easier to disqualify than to qualify. I think a really easy one is, if your studio is a subdivision of a larger company, you're probably not an indie. I mean, it's literally called independent for a reason. If your company has someone to report to, well, you're probably not independent. Just because a small group of people made something, that does not automatically quantify it as independent. It's like being a Nepo game studio. You truly just have more resources at your disposal. I think a good example of this is probably Midrocket, who developed Dave the Diver. There was actually controversy about it being called an indie game in various publications, but they're owned by Nexon, who is a huge South Korean video game developer and publisher. Midrocket themselves have said they are not indie. I think games like that are probably best quantified as AA, but we're not focusing on that. Okay, so we have one disqualifier. What else? What about the number of people working on a game? I think most people would say 5 people working on a game is indie, probably even 10, but what about 15 plus? I think once again that there is some nuance there, but I think we've stretched indie a little far in this regard. Supergiant Games makes Hades. I think most people would consider Hades indie. And I think most people consider Supergiant Games indie because they're not backed by anyone major. But they're also now a 25-person studio, and their games make millions of dollars. I'm not sure that I personally consider them indie anymore, and I think that some studios eventually outgrow the title. It's like if you go to greet your old friend Jim Bob, and he stops you and he says, "Hey, actually, it's James now." I think Supergiant has largely outgrown the title based on their size and wealth. They're not AAA by any means, but I'm not sure the little me and Supergiant Games should be in the same category. So I think it's safe to say at 25 plus people, you're no longer indie, you're just small. I also brought up money earlier, which is super important. I think part of being indie is about resources, and money is typically the biggest one that a studio needs to survive. That's not to say that funding is enough to disqualify you. That doesn't make any sense. It's silly. Let's say you had like $3 million. That sounds like a big number, I know, but let's say you have a team of 10 and you're paying for software, maybe office space, marketing, salaries, computers, etc. You could easily blow through that money before a game is ever released. In fact, you could do that in just a few years, assuming that everyone is making a livable wage, which isn't even necessarily true for plenty of indie studios. I'm just saying, like, let's give the benefit of the doubt that we are doing that. But what about mega hits? Silksong by Team Cherry was just released, and it made a bajillion dollars. But it was made by literally 3 people over the course of 6 years. Would you not say that Silksong is an indie game? Or no, because the original Hollow Knight also made a bajillion dollars, and therefore they had all the resources in the world. I think for me, personally, that's still indie. But I can understand that for you, perhaps you don't agree and that isn't the case. But I do have a more extreme example to potentially win you over. Local Thunk made Balatro. He even had a publisher in place, and Balatro made an ungodly amount of money. But once again, this is one person who contracted out a handful of things. But effectively, he was as indie as I am. Perhaps even more because I own an LLC, and I bet that he did not at the time of conception. Is his next game not indie anymore because he's rich? How rich does someone have to be to no longer be indie? I think for the sake of the video, we're just gonna have to call money a toss-up. While it could help tip the scales on whether you're indie or not, I don't think it can be a deciding factor. The next thing I'll bring up is structure of the studio. I think that there's a grassrootness about indie games that truly becomes something else once you have job grades and bureaucracy. Like if someone is going onto Glassdoor and rating the CEO, I'm not sure I consider you indie anymore. I meant that as a joke for the most part. I just mean if it feels corporate, then it probably is, and therefore isn't indie anymore. So let's take a look at where we're at. If you have a parent company or backing/support of a major studio, not indie. Over 25 plus full-time employees, no longer indie. Tons of money at your disposal, inconclusive. Corporate structure, not indie. I think the last thing that disqualifies you from being indie is objectively saying that you are not indie. If Jeff Bezos got 3 of the best game developers in the world and a budget of $100 million, made a game and then said it was AAA, would you argue that this is an indie game? Are you going to argue and say that this is an indie game just because it's a 4-person studio? Absolutely not. This is me circling back to the Dave the Diver dev who actively said they weren't indie, yet were nominated for several indie awards. That was just silly. But that leads me to, and I'm sure many of you are asking the question, why does it matter? Why does this matter? Why are we having this conversation? And I think that there are 2 schools of thought here. The first is that ultimately it doesn't matter. There's no legal designation or requirement of being indie. And as such, anyone can say or do whatever they want. And it's truly just up for the court of opinions to decide. And I think the other camp is that we have to protect indie spaces. Because if we don't, these teams with more resources and money and people will outshine us in spaces meant to show off our talents and ingenuity, take away opportunities from smaller teams, smaller devs, spaces meant to support our work and show off small creators. Personally, I rarely ever buy a AAA game at full price. Almost never. But I've bought many indie games at full price just to show support, because I wanted to support the devs and the studio and the work they're doing. And I think many people share this sentiment, which is why that this is a recurring debate almost yearly. So let me know in the comments, what do you think makes an indie game or not? Are there any games released lately that you think was misidentified? And if you made it this far into the video, thank you so much for listening to my yap session, and please like and subscribe if you enjoyed it. Fun fact, when I wrote the script, it was originally designed to be a short, and I guess I just had too much to say. By the way, if you want to extra support this indie dev, you can check out my game Trivia War, which is available on Steam. It helps support me and of course this channel. Once again, my name is Tez Freezer. Thank you for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.